A Padded Chinese Jacket by Li Jiatong, translated by Daniel J. Bauer. Our school has a worker getting up in years now, a retired soldier we call Uncle Zhang. Before the Chinese New Year festival, when he heard I was to go to Hangzhou in mainland China for a scholarly meeting, Grandpa Zhang came to see me. Could I be of assistance to him by doing a certain favor? Uncle Zhang had me take a look at an indescribably old Chinese jacket with a thick cotton padding, what we call a mianao. It was obvious he hadn't worn that jacket for ages. Clearly, however, that mianao meant something very special to him. When he was a soldier many years ago, Uncle Zhang took part in the Battle of Shubang, the turning point of the Chinese Civil War. The battle that marked the end of nationalist dominance in northern China, 1948 to 1949. The fighting was fierce. For a period of time, Uncle Zhang's battalion found itself actually surrounded by communist guerrillas. Although our Air Force tried to drop food and medical supplies and such behind the enemy lines, often the material landed in hostile territory. So, for quite a spell, Uncle was caught between the fate of freezing to death or starving. His condition was truly desperate. There were no necessities of life, and they lacked ammunition. At one point in that predicament, a group of communist infantrymen attacked his battalion, but Uncle Zhang and his comrades were able to drive the enemy back. Although the men could take a brief break, Uncle Zhang wasn't only cold and hungry, he was practically dying of thirst. He had emptied his canteen down to the very last drop. Uncle Zhang spotted a communist soldier he had just shot to death. He had a canteen tied to his waist. Grandpa ran over to the body and grabbed that canteen. As he unfastened the loops of the canteen, he discovered the soldier was still carrying some dry rations. The weather those days was getting increasingly frigid, and so the soldier had been wearing a fine jacket, a mianao. In Uncle Zhang's mind, the fellow was already gone. He stripped off the mianao and put it on beneath his outer layer of clothes. He even took the shoes the soldier had on his feet. Uncle Zhang told me that if he hadn't gotten the soldier's mianao and canteen, and those dry rations, he'd have probably frozen to death. Without food or water, he'd have died on the battlefield. So since then, wherever he went, he always took that mianao along with him. Deep in his heart, he always felt thankful for the original owner of that jacket. Sometime after Uncle Zhang had gotten out of that jam, he found the name of the soldier who owned that mianao inside the jacket, and the name of his hometown too. The soldier's family had written his name and address on a small card, and stuffed the card deep between the lining of an inside pocket. The soldier's name was Li Xiaobai. His hometown was an obscure village in Banji Mountain in Zhejiang Province. Although Uncle Zhang was very grateful to Li Xiaobai, he dared not establish contact with his family. The reason is that it was his gun that took that man's life. At the time, he himself was only 19 years old. He reckoned that Li Xiaobai was probably in his late teens when his life ended. Now, he might have faced a fair amount of suffering in the beginning when he first came to Taiwan. But Uncle Jiang already had a grandson, now majoring in electrical engineering at Tsinghua University. Although things had panned out well for him, thoughts of Li Xiaobai's family had always gnawed at his heart. He hadn't a clue as to how their lives had turned out. He gave me a certain amount of money, telling me to take it to the mainland and give it to Li Xiaobai's loved ones. He said that out in the countryside, people generally lived for years and years in the same place. I ought to be able to find their place all right, he thought. Uncle Jiang asked me to tell Li's family that he may have killed Xiaobai, but by no stretch of the imagination did he consider him his enemy. He himself came from a poverty-stricken family. Joining the army was simply impossible to avoid. In those days, he had no clear idea of just why he was fighting the communists. He also believed Li Xiaobai was in the same position. He too was determined to end the war thing as quickly as possible, return home, and work as a farmer. He put it this way: we were just ordinary people, and between ordinary people there is no feeling of enmity. It was the big wheels who pushed us into that war. What could we do? After my meeting ended in Hangzhou, I headed for Banji Mountain. While I was still at the meeting, I asked people how I could get to Banji Mountain. No one knew. In the end, I just figured it out on my own. I hopped back and forth from one form of transport to the other, and finally found myself in a hired car on the road to that little village on the outskirts of Banji Mountain. Li Xiaobai's old home was on the side of a mountain. To tell you the truth, it was not simply a place in the middle of nowhere. It was downright desolate out there. The road leading into the mountain was a single stretch of twists and turns, and from the road itself you couldn't even see places for people to live. In fact, you could hardly see any vehicles on the road. Eventually, I caught sight of a public bus taking people up and down the mountain. It was winter time, so all the trees were bare of leaves. It turned out the car didn't have a heater. Luckily for me, I was wearing a thick down sweater, and after all, it was a sunny day, so I really didn't feel cold. We arrived at the village, and after asking everyone in sight, sure enough, we found the family of Li Xiaobai. People out there in the countryside rarely see a car arrive with a visitor. One by one, folks came out to take a look at just what this strange visitor looked like. Actually, this family was very large. There was an elderly gentleman who couldn't get around very well. He needed a cane for walking. He asked me to take a seat. Suddenly, a wave of anxiety flooded over me. I didn't know how to open my mouth. I stuttered and stammered and finally managed to get Uncle Jiang's story out. I hammered home the point Uncle had made about the two men being just common, ordinary people, without the slightest amount of animosity between them. Then, finally, I pulled out the old card, now all yellow. On it were written the characters Li Xiaobai. The elderly gentleman picked that card up in his hand and looked at it. The whole room had fallen as silent as could be. They were waiting for him to speak. The elderly man's hand trembled slightly. After he had scrutinized that card, he finally had something to say. And what he said was, "I am Li Xiaobai. I didn't die." The story goes like this. The day before the battle, Li Xiaobai caught a shot in the middle of his thigh and couldn't move, he couldn't even crawl on the ground, let alone take a step. His company commander called over a couple of buck privates and had them lay him flat on a stretcher. They covered him with a blanket. The commander ordered the men to take Li Xiaobai back to the medical station. As Li Xiaobai was about to leave the scene, a buddy of his asked him for his canteen and dry rations. He figured that back of the line of fire there would be no shortage of water or food. Li gave him not only his water and rations, but also his jacket and shoes. After all, it looked like he wouldn't be back on his feet walking around for a while, and the blanket over him was warm enough already. It never occurred to him that his friend would get killed the next day. Although he made it to the medical station, as things turned out, he wound up disabled. For the rest of his life, he would need a cane to get around. The Liberation Army gave him a bit of money and sent him home. As time went on, he thought of his friend now and again, but had no idea how to get in touch with him. It was only today that he had learned that his old buddy left our world so early. The elderly gentleman's words left me speechless. I decided not to mention the money that Uncle Zhang had sent along with me. I was worried the old fellow would fear it might bring him bad luck. Happily enough, the elderly Mr. Li broke the rigid atmosphere in the room. He had someone bring me a big steaming bowl of congee. Then came some side dishes. "Go ahead now and eat," he said. I ate with relish. I had never imagined you could use congee to welcome a guest. Old Mr. Li asked me how Uncle Zhang's life had panned out in Taiwan. I told him that his time as a soldier was of course tough for him. After he got out of the army, his life improved a little. In recent years, he had it pretty good though. He had what he needed: food, clothes, and so on. Old Mr. Li said his whole life had been a hard go. Once he had been a farmer, but after his wound, he couldn't till his land. Fortunately, from the very beginning, his wife had been good to him. No one in his family bore any resentment. I said that Uncle Zhang had 2 sons who became workers, but more than that, his grandchildren had all received good educations. In fact, one of them was an electrical engineering major at National Tsinghua University in Hsinchu. When the elderly Li heard this, he immediately became visibly excited. He said his sons were all farmers, but he had a grandson who would soon be a university student. "My grandson's smart as a chip and won himself a county scholarship," he went on. "That helped him go to a good middle school in the city, and now he's already in his 3rd year there. He's gotten real high grades in his practice exams, and I'm quite sure he'll get into a first-rate university. We're in the middle of the Chinese New Year break, so my grandson's on vacation. Although he's not here now, he'll soon be coming home." After a while, I was able to take my own measure of this smart young fellow. He told me his test scores could probably get him into the electrical engineering department at National Tsinghua University in Beijing. In the event his hopes for Tsinghua did not work out, I encouraged him to try to get into National Jiaotong University. "That's also a fine school," I said. This young man was keenly interested in this visitor who had come all the way from Taiwan. He said his whole life he had a hope. He hoped to visit the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and see what went on there. He revealed another dream. He wanted to hear Ame sing in person. He said he had an Ame poster over in his dormitory. A moment of inspiration came to me. I wanted to slip out of the sweater I was wearing and give it to this young man. It was a beautiful sweater. My wife had bought it for me. My wife was always worrying about how I dressed, me, this old goat. So she was always picking up something fashionable for me. She wanted to make me fashionable. It was a pity my hair had already turned white. The latest in fashion trends didn't look fashionable at all on me. The young fellow put the sweater on immediately. There was just no comparison. That sweater sure looked good on him. He said he'd be sure to wear it around the campus at Tsinghua. He'd get a picture of it too. And as for me, once I had taken the sweater off, I felt just a hint of a chill. The older Mr. Lee noticed and went into the room for something. He came back and handed me a mian ao. The older Mr. Lee and I finally said our farewells. He asked me to tell Uncle Jiang to take good care of himself. He wanted me to say hello to Uncle's family. He hoped everyone there would enjoy good health and prosperity. That mian ao flew over the ocean with me. It even drew compliments from one of the flight attendants. She claimed she had never seen a piece of clothing as eye-catching as that jacket and wondered where I had bought it. I saw Uncle Jiang. He was happy that Li Xiaobai's life had taken such a happy turn, but he expressed his endless affection and thanks, but also remorse for his benefactor, a man whose name he would never know. I had no way to convince him to look at the positives in the situation. Well, I had never been caught in the thick of battle. Maybe it was just not possible to climb inside an old soldier's mind and know how he thought and felt. Uncle Jiang's grandson, who was studying in Hsinchu at Tsinghua, came home to visit his grandfather. He took one look at the mian ao that had come from mainland China and begged me to give it to him. I made another discovery. He looked terrific in that jacket. As I gazed at this young Taiwanese youth, the image of that soon-to-be university student on the mainland popped into my head. I envied the two of them. I envied the grandson of Uncle Jiang and the grandson of the older Mr. Lee as well. Those two had bright futures. What a happy place they would stand in if one day they could meet. Maybe it would happen at an Ame concert, or possibly while they were exchanging scholarly research at an academic conference on semiconductors. Surely they wouldn't be like their grandfathers. They wouldn't be looking at each other on a desperately cold battlefield.